For 27 years, the last confirmed sight of Bonnie Rhodes was a girl in a yellow dress walking toward the Ferris wheel at the Sweetwater Gap County Fair on a warm September night in 1992. She was 17. She told her friends she'd meet them by the funnel cake stand in 20 minutes. She never came back, and the small Tennessee town searched for her for years and found nothing. And slowly, the fair lights of that night became the last anyone would ever see of Bonnie Rhodes. It would take 27 years, a roll of undeveloped film found in a dead woman's attic, and a single frame nobody had ever looked at to show what was at the edge of the crowd that night, and to name the man who had been waiting by the Ferris wheel. That is not a story about a girl who ran away from a county fair. That is a story about a crowded night where hundreds of people were looking the wrong way, and about the photograph that finally looked the right way, 27 years too late and just in time. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to the East Tennessee hills in the autumn of 1992, and to the bright girl who walked into a crowd and out of the world. Sweetwater Gap in 1992 sat in a fold of the East Tennessee mountains, tobacco and hay in the bottoms, hardwood ridges going to flame in October, a town of maybe 2,000 where the Baptist church and the high school football team divided the town's devotion about evenly. The county fair was the event of the year, a week every September when the whole county converged on the fairgrounds for the rides and the livestock and the funnel cakes and the reunion of everyone you'd ever known. It was the safest night of the year, or felt like it. A town's entire population in one lit field, everyone among friends. Which is exactly why what happened there was so hard to understand. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew Bonnie Rhodes. Bonnie was 17, a high school senior, a bright and popular girl with a wide, easy smile and a plan to be the first in her family to go to college. Nursing, she'd decided, like the aunt she admired and wanted to be like. She sang in the church choir, ran the 800 on the track team, and worked Saturdays at her father's hardware store, where she knew the regulars and the price of every box of nails. She had a boyfriend, a sweet, shy boy named Travis on the football team, who'd been working up the nerve all summer to ask her to homecoming, and a best friend, Dana, who'd been at her side since the second grade and was with her at the fair that night. She was excited about everything that fall, senior year, the applications, the dance, the way a girl is excited when her whole life is finally about to open up. And Bonnie had one thing the town would always remember her by: a bright yellow sundress she'd bought with her own hardware store money just for the fair. A dress she'd been talking about for weeks. The dress that made her easy to find in any crowd, and that every single witness from that night would describe the same way. A girl in yellow, moving through the carnival lights. On the night of September 18, 1992, Bonnie Rhodes told her friends she'd be right back, walked toward the Ferris wheel through a fairground packed with everyone she'd ever known, and was never seen again. Here is the cruelty of where she vanished. She disappeared in the middle of a crowd, hundreds of people, the entire county all around her, and that crowd, instead of protecting her, hid what happened to her. Because in a packed fairground, everyone is looking at the lights and the rides and their own friends, and no one is watching one girl in yellow walk toward one ride. The sheriff, a decent man named Earl Combs, ran a frantic search the moment Bonnie was reported missing that night, sealing the fairgrounds, questioning hundreds of fairgoers. But hundreds of witnesses in a chaotic, crowded, half-dark fair produced a fog, not a picture. Everyone had seen the girl in yellow at some point, and no one had seen what became of her. The leads were 100 contradictory glimpses. The investigation, drowning in a crowd's worth of useless sightings, slowly stalled. And with no body, no scene, and a 17-year-old who'd walked off on her own toward a ride, the runaway theory crept in at the edges. Maybe a bright girl bound for college had bolted from a small town, though everyone who knew Bonnie rejected it. The detail that should have mattered, and that no one could use in 1992, was photographic. Hundreds of people had cameras at that fair. It was 1992. Film cameras, the whole county snapping pictures of their kids on the rides. Somewhere in all those photographs, almost certainly, was the background of Bonnie's last walk, the edge of the crowd by the Ferris wheel, whoever was standing there. But there was no way, in 1992, to gather and search hundreds of rolls of family film. Most of it never even developed. Much of it never thought of again. The answer was scattered across the county in shoeboxes and camera bags, and there was no way to find it. The person who never accepted the runaway theory was Bonnie's best friend, Dana, who had been standing right there when Bonnie said she'd be right back. Dana knew Bonnie had been happy, knew about the college plans and the boyfriend and the excitement over a yellow dress, knew her friend had not run anywhere. She'd said she'd be back in 20 minutes, and she'd meant it. Dana told the sheriff, told everyone, that Bonnie had not run away. She was a grieving 17-year-old, and her certainty couldn't cut through the fog of 1,000 sightings. But Dana carried it. She grew up, stayed in Sweetwater Gap, and never let a September pass without thinking of a girl in yellow and a promise to come right back. The institutional failure here was not negligence or cover-up. It was the paradox of the crowd. The very thing that should have made the fairground safe, a multitude of witnesses, made it impossible to investigate. Because a multitude of partial glimpses cancels out into nothing, and there was no tool in 1992 to assemble the one true picture from the hundreds of useless ones. Bonnie Rhodes wasn't failed by a lazy search. She was failed by the limits of what a search could do in a pre-digital age, swimming in more witnesses than it could use. Then the case went cold under the weight of its own crowd. The fair came back the next September, and the next, and people felt strange on the midway for a few years, and then stopped feeling strange. The town moved on. The girl in yellow became a sad story told late at night, a cautionary tale with no ending. By 2002, 10 years had passed. Bonnie's father had sold the hardware store. He couldn't stand behind the counter where she'd worked Saturdays, and aged a decade in each of the first few years. Travis, the boyfriend who'd never gotten to ask her to homecoming, had married someone else and carried a grief he didn't talk about, leaving the fair off his family's September every year. Sheriff Combs had retired, haunted to the end by the one case he could never make come into focus, the night the whole county was a witness and no one saw a thing. Dana had become a school teacher in town, married, raised kids of her own, and still kept a photo of herself and Bonnie at 16, arms around each other, stuck to her refrigerator where she'd see it every morning. By 2014, the county fair was still held every September on the same fairgrounds, the Ferris wheel still turning, and most of the teenagers riding it had never heard the name Bonnie Rhodes, or had heard it only as a half-remembered ghost story older kids told. The case was a yellowed file in a cabinet, but the world had quietly changed in a way no one had yet connected to Bonnie. The family photographs of 1992, the countless rolls of film shot at that fair and every fair, were beginning to surface and digitize as a generation aged and their houses were cleaned out. Old film finally developed, faded prints scanned and shared online, a whole vanished decade coming back into view one image at a time. The answer that had been scattered across the county in shoeboxes and forgotten camera bags was, slowly and without anyone intending it, coming into the light. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Bonnie. The case had been cold for 27 years when the crowd that hid Bonnie finally gave her up, through a single photograph. In 2019, an elderly woman who had lived in Sweetwater Gap died, and her family, clearing her attic, found a box of undeveloped rolls of film, decades old, the kind of thing people meant to develop and never did. Among them were rolls from the 1992 county fair. The family had them developed out of curiosity, and in scanning the old images, kids on rides, families at the fair, a vanished world in faded color, they came across frames from the night the whole county still quietly remembered. The night the Rhodes girl disappeared. One of the woman's photographs, snapped to capture her own grandchildren on the Ferris wheel, had caught something else at the edge of the frame. The family recognized what they were looking at and called the sheriff. Here is the truth of how this case broke, and it hinged on technology that was old, not new. The photograph had existed since 1992. What had changed was simply that it had finally been developed, scanned, and could now be enlarged and enhanced digitally. In the background of that family snapshot, behind the grandchildren on the ride, was the Ferris wheel loading area. And there, unmistakable once you knew to look, was a girl in a yellow dress. Bonnie Rhodes, alive, in the last moment anyone would ever capture her. And standing beside her, his hand on her arm, leaning in close, was a man. When investigators enhanced the frame, the man's face came clear enough to matter. It was not a stranger. It was Dale Pruitt, who in 1992 had been a 35-year-old carnival worker traveling with the company that ran the fair's rides, the man who operated the Ferris wheel that very night. A drifter through the county every September with the fair, invisible the way carnival workers are invisible, gone with the company when the fair packed up and moved on. No one in 1992 had thought to look hard at the carnival workers, who were strangers passing through, here one week and gone the next, leaving no local trace to investigate. The photograph alone was a lid, not a conviction, and investigators knew it. But it gave them, for the first time in 27 years, a name and a face to pursue, and pursuing it cracked everything open. They identified Dale Pruitt through the old carnival company's employment records and found that he was still alive, 62 now, long out of the carnival business, living in another state. They found, in the company's surviving route records, that Pruitt had been with fairs near 2 other unsolved disappearances of young women in other states in other Septembers, a pattern that no single county had ever been able to see, because the man moved with the fair and the fair moved on. And critically, the enhanced photograph jogged loose a witness. A man who'd been a teenager working the midway that night came forward after the image was made public, finally certain of something he'd half seen and never reported, that he'd glimpsed the Ferris wheel operator walking a girl in yellow toward the workers' trailers behind the ride. Confronted with the photograph that placed his hand on Bonnie Rhodes's arm in her last living moment, and the pattern of fairs and disappearances that followed him across the years, Dale Pruitt's denials collapsed. He admitted he had lured Bonnie behind the ride that night, that he had killed her, and that he had concealed her body in the carnival's own equipment and carried her out of the county when the fair packed up and rolled on to the next town 2 days later. Which was why no search of Sweetwater Gap had ever found her, because she had left the county inside the very fair that had brought him. He eventually led investigators to where he had finally disposed of her, 2 states away along the carnival's old route, and after 27 years, Bonnie Rhodes was recovered. When the truth came out, Sweetwater Gap was shaken to its core. The arrest shocked the community, but the deeper horror was the realization that the safest night of the year had been the most dangerous, that the man running the Ferris wheel their children rode had been a predator moving with the fair, and that Bonnie had been carried out of the county inside the same caravan of lights that came back, smiling, every single September after. Dale Pruitt was convicted in 2021 and sentenced to life, with investigations opening into the disappearances along his old route in other states. And Bonnie Rhodes came home to the East Tennessee hills 27 years after she'd walked toward the Ferris wheel in a yellow dress. Her best friend Dana, who had been standing right there when Bonnie said she'd be right back, and who had insisted for 27 years that her friend had never run away, helped lay her to rest, and had a stone cut with Bonnie's name and a single line. She always meant to come right back. Bonnie Rhodes was 17 years old. She sang in the choir and ran track and worked her father's hardware store counter. And she was bound to be the first in her family to go to college. And she bought a bright yellow dress with her own money because she was so excited for the county fair. She did not run away. She was taken in the middle of a crowd of everyone who loved her, by a stranger who came with the lights and left with them, and the crowd that should have kept her safe instead hid what happened, until a photograph, undeveloped for 27 years, finally looked where no one had been able to look that night. The friend who never stopped believing was proven right, and a girl in yellow, lost in a crowd for nearly 3 decades, was finally found. It makes you wonder. How many people vanished in plain sight, in crowds, at fairs and festivals and busy places, precisely because a multitude of witnesses produces no clear picture? How many answers are sitting in undeveloped rolls of film and unscanned shoeboxes right now in attics across the country, waiting to be looked at for the first time? And how many predators moved freely for years because they traveled, with a carnival, a circuit, a season, always gone before any one place could see the pattern? Tell us in the comments. Do you think Bonnie's case would ever have been solved if that woman's film had stayed undeveloped in her attic? What detail stayed with you most? The yellow dress? The hand on her arm in the photograph? The fair that carried her away? And how many disappearances at crowded events do you believe are sitting unsolved? An answer hidden in some stranger's background photograph. Justice came for Bonnie Rhodes after 27 years, given up at last by a single frame of film that had waited in an attic since the night she vanished. Stories like hers remind us that a crowd can hide as easily as it protects, that the answer may already exist in a photograph no one has looked at, and that to be found, named, and brought home from a crowd that swallowed you is its own form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.